In this video, you're going to learn how to simulate user interaction in your test cases. So our expense form component has a lot of handlers. We have onSubmit handlers and we have quite a few onChange handlers. To actually test this component, we want to simulate those events. So for example, if I submit the form with bad data, I would expect that an error gets set and rendered to the screen. How exactly do I write a test case to do that? So this is what we're going to start off with. We're going to write a test case that makes sure an error gets rendered when the form is submitted without a description or without an amount. If we can at least get that test case done, then we'll have all of the tools in our tool belt to test all of the stuff up above. So we're going to kick things off over inside of the expense form test file by creating a brand new test case. We can call this one something like should render error for invalid form submission. Then we're going to go ahead and set up the function, and step one is to still just shallow render the component. I'm going to make a const wrapper, and I'll use shallow to render it. I'm going to render expense form. And once we do have expense form rendered, we're going to focus on actually submitting to the form. So what we need to do is first find the form, and then we have to simulate submit. Now, we already used find before when I first introduced Enzyme, and if you remember, it gets called onWrapper. So wrapper.find, and we can find things by ID, by class, by tag name. In this case, we are looking for something by tag name. We have one form, and we're looking for that. So now we have access to the form element in the expense form component, and what we need to do is simulate an event. Now, simulate is a little tricky to use, so I do want to show you where the documentation lives for that. This comes from Enzyme, so we're going to pull up the Enzyme docs once again, airbnb.io/enzyme. And once we're there, we're going to pull up the API reference. We're going to go over to shallow rendering, and down below we are looking for simulate. Everything's in alphabetical order, so you just got to scroll down to S. So right here we have simulate. Simulate gets called with the event. This is a string and the potential event arguments. So if we just take a quick example down below, we can see they use wrapper.find to find something by class, and they check the length. Then down below, they use wrapper.find to find an anchor tag, and they simulate a click. Then they check the length of something else. So here they are checking the initial state, they're interacting with the component, and then they're checking the final state. This is the important part though, being able to simulate an event. So we're going to go ahead and use simulate just like this, but instead of click, we're going to use submit and change. We can go ahead and get this done by switching back over to the terminal, and inside of Visual Studio Code right here, we're going to call simulate. Now remember, the first thing is the event. It's a string, so it could be click, it could be submit, it could be change. All of these are valid. We're going to be sticking with submit since this form has an onSubmit handler. Now from here, what we need to do is actually verify that things changed as expected, but this alone is not quite enough. So if we go ahead and save things, we're going to get an error over inside of Jest. Right here, we can see that one of our test cases failed, and if we do scroll up, it is the should render error for invalid form submission. And we're getting a type error, cannot read property prevent default of undefined. So prevent default is used over here inside of our onChange handler. We use e.prevent_default to prevent the browser's default behavior, which is to automatically refresh the page. So what we need to do is fake this, because right now when we simulate onSubmit, we aren't passing in anything for this. So this is getting set to undefined in our test cases, and that's going to be a problem. Now we can define the e argument by passing a second argument right here. So we want it to be an object since we are expecting an object. And what are we expecting on that object? Just a single property, the one that we actually end up using, prevent default, and it's a function. So right here, we can create prevent default. I can set it equal to just an arrow function that does absolutely nothing, and this is going to be enough to remove that error that we're seeing over in Jest. Now if I save things once again, we're going to see that all of our test cases are passing. Now this one's not passing for the right reasons, we haven't made any assertions, but at least it's not throwing an error so far. Now, where do we want to go from here? Well, at this point, we want to make sure that what should have happened did actually happen. And what should have happened? Well, if we go over to the thing we're testing, this if statement should have passed, which means that this code should have run. So we should now have a state for error that does indeed contain something as opposed to being an empty string. And we can go ahead and test for that by fetching the state off of wrapper. Now, once again, I do want to show you where that lives in Enzyme because we're about to use a brand new method. If we go over to the Enzyme documentation, we are scrolling down to state. State, defined down here, allows us to fetch the state for the component. So you can see there are a couple different ways we can use it. We can call wrapper.state with no arguments to return the entire state object, or we can call it with the specific thing we're looking for. And in that case, this approach will work just fine. So we're going to write an expect statement that fetches the state and makes sure that it's not an empty string. We're going to go ahead and do that right over here by expecting something about. Then we're going to access wrapper.state. I'm looking for the error state, and then I'm going to use one of our expect assertions. And we're going to be using to be greater than. Now, if we're checking to be greater than, it expects a number. So we're going to say to be greater than 0. And what we need to do is actually get the length of the string. So now we're getting the length of the error field, and we're expecting it to be greater than 0. If it is 0, we have a problem, and the test case is going to fail. If I save things, the jest suite will rerun, and we should still see passing tests. If the simulate call never happens, and we run the test case this time around, the test is indeed failing because the form was never submitted, so the default error state was used, and by default, it's just an empty string. So it's important that we take all 3 steps. Now, we can also wrap up this test case with a quick snapshot. That's going to make sure the error always renders correctly. Right here, I can expect wrapper dot to match snapshot. This is going to make sure that after the error state changes, it actually does get rendered. And if we wanted to, we could add another snapshot beforehand too, to make sure that no error shows up. So you can add as many snapshots as you like into your test cases. I can take one snapshot before I make the changes and one after. This is going to make sure that those 2 snapshots match up the next time this test case runs. Now, if we go ahead and save the expense form.test.js file, we see we do have all of our test cases passing. So before we move on to another test case, I do just want to take a quick peek at the snap file for this one. If we scroll down, we should be able to get to the new test case items, should render error for invalid form submission. This is the second one where the error should show up, and it's right here. So now that we know the snap contains the correct stuff, we're going to be able to track that. And if we continue to scroll down, scroll up, we should be able to get to the first one from that test case right here. And this time around, you can see there is no error in sight, which is once again correct. So now we have a test case that makes sure that error code runs and the actual impact of the error code running works as expected. Before I set you free, I do want to show you how we can also simulate the change event. And to do that, we're going to make sure that when the description input changes, it actually does indeed set the state for the description with the correct value. To get that done, we're going to add a new test case. Should set description on input change. We can set up that arrow function, and the goal inside of here is to 1, render expense form, 2, change the input, and 3, make an assertion checking that the description state was set. So the first one is easy, const wrapper equals, and we will just shallow render the component like we've been doing plenty of times before. We could pass data in or we could pass no data in, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to go with this. And now the goal is to submit the change event. So the first thing we have to do is access the element. We are going to be using wrapper.find to get that done. Now we're going to be finding inputs. And when we find input, we're actually going to match multiple inputs, right? Because we have multiple inputs inside of our component. So what we want to do is match the first input. That is the input for the description, which is what we're looking to test. We have access to do that via the at method we can call. At lets you pass in the index you'd like back. So I can use 0 for the first input, 1 for the second, so on and so forth. If you want to learn more about at, once again, it is part of the Enzyme documentation. If you scroll way up, it should be one of the first ones. Yep, it's the number 1 item. So that is what we just used to fetch by index. Now that we have it fetched by index, the goal is to simulate the change event. Right here, we are still going to be using simulate, and we are still going to be passing something in, a string for the first one, change, and an object for the second one. Now, what object do we need to pass in? Well, if we take a look over at the thing we're testing, we see it's E, and we're trying to access target.value. So we have to make sure target.value actually exists. That's where we provide the data that we try to end up setting. So right here, I'm going to set E equal to an object with target defined on it. Then on there, we're going to define value. Now we can get value from a variable named value. I could create that up above. Value equals new description. And now that we've actually simulated the event, all we have to do is make sure the state changed correctly. Right here, I can expect the wrapper, and then I'm going to access state on there to get some state back. I'm looking for just one piece of state, that is the description. And I'm going to make sure it equals, using to_be, what it should equal, which is the value string. So now that we have this in place, we can save the expense form test file. We can see it's running through the entire test suite, and we have all passing test cases, which is great. Now, if things didn't work as expected, we would get errors. So if our description wasn't set, or it was set to a different value, like the e.target.value plus the string exclamation mark, the test case would indeed fail, letting us know exactly what went wrong. So we've done this once for description. It is going to be your job to do the exact same thing for on-note change. Now remember, on-note change is working with a text area, so you're going to have to fetch by text area, not input. We can call the test something like should set note on text area change. So take some time to knock that one out, going through the exact same steps for the note field, then test your work. Make sure that it does actually work, the new test case you wrote, that is. Pause the video, knock this out, and when you're done, click play. All right, let's go ahead and get this one done. I am going to take the comment right here, cut it out, and use that for the test name. Test, the first argument is a string. I'm just going to paste it in. The second one is our test function. Now, with some of these test cases, we could just choose to copy one that's similar and paste it down below. Now we can make changes necessary to get this to work. I'm going to change new description over to new note value. I'm still going to be shallow rendering expense form. The only difference down here is that I'm no longer going to be finding an input. I'm going to be finding a text area, and there's just one, so we don't actually need @ Now we are still simulating a change event. We do still want target value to be defined. Last up, we are going to be accessing off of the state, not description, but note, and we're going to be expecting it to be of some value. Now, if we go ahead and save the expense form test file, we should see another passing test case, and that is exactly what we have. Now that was an easy one, but I'd like you to write 2 more test cases as well. So right here, you're going to be writing 2 test cases for the changes to amount. In one of them, you are going to set the amount equal to something valid, something that will make this if statement pass and have the state set. In the other one, you're actually going to set it equal to something invalid and make sure the state does not get set. So I'll give you some test data over here. Should set amount if valid input. And for this one, you could use an input value that is valid. So for example, 23.50 is completely valid. For the other one, should not set amount if invalid input. You're going to want to use an invalid value. So that could be something along the lines of 12.122. So this is invalid because there are 2 numbers after the decimal place, and our regular expression is not going to allow this to pass. So your job is to write test cases for each. In this one, you're going to make sure the state does get set to this. In this one, you're going to make sure the state does not get set at all. Take as much time as you need to write these ones out, and feel free to refer to any of the test cases we've written so far. You can pull up the documentation if you need to. Take a moment to pause the video, knock this out, test your work, and when you're done, click play. All right, how'd that go? 2 challenges in 2 minutes. As we know more, I'm going to make you write more. So to kick this one off, I am just going to take one of our previous tests. I can grab this one up above, and I'm going to repurpose it for our needs right here and down below. So for the first test case, step 1, I'm just going to swap out the titles. Now, are we still trying to set a value? Yes, the value is just going to be a little bit different. For this one, we want to make sure to use a valid amount. So I will use 23.50. Now we are still going to shallow render expense form, and we're still going to do something to an input, just not this input. We are looking to access the second input. So you did have to make a change to @ as well. Now we are going to simulate the change event with the value. All of this looks good. And the last thing we need to do is actually make an assertion. We need to check wrapper.state and confirm that it is the expected result. Now we're not looking for the description state. We are looking for the amount state. And we're checking that it equals the value we set. Now we can go ahead and move on to the second test case. Once again, I am going to swap out the titles. This time around, though, we are going to change the value string to something invalid, like 12.122. I'm still going to shallow render expense form, and I'm still going to simulate something on that second input. It is going to be the change event where I set the value. Last up, once again, we just have to grab the amount instead of the description. Now, in this case, we are hoping that it did not change. So we can go ahead and use any assertion we like. I'm going to check that it still equals an empty string, which should be the default value considering I didn't pass anything in. Now that we have all of this in place, we can actually go ahead and save the expense form test files. We can see we have our new 2 test cases in place and both of them are passing, which is a great next step. Now we have quite a few different test cases for expense form, making sure that it always works as expected, handling all of the cases, all of those if statements, making sure we actually trigger both paths. So that's where we're going to stop for this one. In this video, we learned quite a few things. We learned that we can simulate events like this. We passed the event name into simulate and the event object. We also learned that we can access individual inputs, in this case, by their index. And all of this is allowing us to create some meaningful test cases. Last up, we learned that we can access the state of the component we're working with using .state. This allows us to read either the entire state, or in the case of this one, we pass in a string to read an individual state value. We're going to continue learning about new testing techniques, and the goal of the next one is to figure out how we can test the success case. So we're going to have to learn a few new tricks to get that done. In the next one, you're going to learn all about test spies, so stay tuned. I'll see you then.